Hey guys, Heidi Preep here. I have been getting a lot of requests for more INFP content, so I decided to kind of kick this off with a video that I already did for ENFPs, and as always, I was like, are these two types really that different when it comes to this topic that it warrants two different videos? And then I sat down and wrote some stuff out and was like, oh yeah, this needs to be its own video. So this is a video about the main things that INFPs tend to struggle with in relationships. And this doesn't necessarily mean that these are like fatal flaws that can't be worked on. It doesn't mean that this will apply to all INFPs. It just means that these are some things to kind of watch out for in your own psyche if you are an INFP, because you might be a little bit more inclined towards them than people of other personality types. That being said, a lot of these will also apply to ENFPs or ISFPs, since those two types share a lot of cognitive functions in a similar order to the INFP. So these aren't exclusive to the INFP. It's more just a conglomerate of the things that INFPs tend to experience difficulty with. So I'm going to move kind of chronologically from challenges that might come up more towards the beginning of a relationship to challenges that might come up as the relationship gets more serious. And challenge number one that we're going to start with is the INFP romanticizing red flags. So this is one that I think is a lot more common to younger INFPs. I don't necessarily see it as much with, let's say, INFPs in like midlife and beyond, but it can show up for absolutely anyone. And this one is kind of a double-edged sword, because one of the most beautiful and brilliant things about the INFP is that they have the tendency to see the best in everyone and to really understand that people who behave badly and people who hurt other people are very often hurting themselves. They have a very deep interest usually in the human psyche and understanding psychology and understanding why people act the way they do. And that is absolutely a strength. Like, I think that that is one of the biggest reasons why INFPs make for some of the best counselors and teachers and communicators, because they really take the time to understand people in a way that a lot of other types don't. But where this can become a little bit of a problem for them is when they give people too much credit or too much of the benefit of the doubt, especially early on in a relationship, and it can cause them to either miss or romanticize red flags. So missing a red flag might look like them kind of explaining away someone's bad behavior, or maybe they're aware from the get-go of some bad behavior someone's done in a past relationship, but they find a way to kind of rationalize and justify it and go, okay, well, maybe I don't know the full story, maybe I need to hear it right from them. And they will generally give people the benefit of the doubt far beyond what other people would. And again, this is a great thing in some situations and a really tricky thing in other situations, because there can also be this tendency to go one step beyond ignoring red flags and to veer into the romanticizing red flags territory, okay? So what that looks like is the INFP actually getting really sold on the idea that this person is just very misunderstood and they are the only person who can understand them. So the fact that this person has some negative qualities that other people might shy away from is actually more attractive in some cases to the INFP, because they want to give that person the feeling of no one else will give you the benefit of the doubt, but I will, because I am very understanding and empathetic, and I want to show you that people can be that way. And there can also be kind of a fantasy there around like turning someone's life around, maybe having a little bit of a savior complex and wanting to be able to help people to change in a way that is more compassionate and loving and caring. And again, that is not a bad mission in and of itself, but when you get stuck in this as an INFP, and again, this is something I see a lot more with younger INFPs, it can, for very obvious reasons, not end up the best. So this is just one to watch out for at the beginning of a budding relationship. Are you bypassing red flags? Are you kind of noticing them but putting them on the back burner? Or are you actually going straight towards the red flags and going, ooh, this is a cool opportunity for me to help someone change and grow and develop? And again, on a small scale, that can be a good thing. In any relationship, small scale ones will come up along the way. So you don't need to worry. There will be lots to work through and be empathetic about as the relationship continues. But you don't want to be starting from that place of, ooh, I'm the only person who can kind of help or save this person, right? That's not the basis of a healthy relationship of any sort, unfortunately. Relationship challenge number two that I see INFPs really struggling with, particularly in the beginning of new relationships, is panicking about problems that do not exist yet. So, because you lead with introverted feeling as your dominant function as an INFP, and extroverted intuition is your auxiliary function, you don't spend a lot of time really living in the present moment. Now, what that means in a relationship is that you are always kind of thinking 10 steps ahead. you aren't really slowed down and focused on what's happening in the moment the same way a type who values, let's say, extroverted sensing might be. But as soon as you meet someone, your mind is already kind of worrying with thoughts about where could this go, what could this look like in the future, and sometimes that means you are picking up on potential things that could happen down the line that are nowhere near happening, that might not even have a solid basis in the reality of who that person is or what your relationship dynamic is, but it is very natural for your mind to kind of go there. And this can lead to INFPs talking themselves out of relationships before they've even really given them a chance to begin and get off the ground. And I find that this is more often a habit of slightly older INFPs who have a bit of a relationship history to draw on, and having that introverted sensing as your tertiary function might lead you to make connections between things that have happened in the past in prior relationships and little tiny things that you see present in a budding relationship that you're worried means the past is about to repeat itself, okay? And it's really, really important to be conscious and aware at this phase of a relationship developing as an INFP of what is happening in real life versus what is happening in your head, okay? Where do you have real evidence of things going wrong or potentially going wrong versus where are you kind of running away with a disaster fantasy? And a good way to combat this is to just get a little bit better at reality testing. So reality testing is one of the facets of emotional intelligence, which is where you just take the story that you have in your head and run it against reality, try to find some concrete evidence or proof for or against whatever it is that you're worried about so that you have a little bit more information to go off of. Because if the things that you're picking up on are true red flags that might lead to really big problems down the line, it's a great thing to be very aware of those, right? That's the antidote to challenge number one. But I find that a lot of the time what INFPs spend their time hyperfixating on is, let's say, something they think that their partner doesn't like about them, something they think will make them incompatible with their partner down the line. But instead of showing up and communicating those things to their partner, asking, hey, is this a way that you feel? Is this something that you think about me or us or our relationship? Will this potential thing be a problem for you down the line if it comes up? Instead of having those conversations, INFPs can choose to ruminate over them instead, and that keeps it out of the realm of the reality, which is where problems get solved, and keeps it concentrated inside of their own minds where problems just grow and grow and grow, right? So to combat this one, it really requires some showing up, some communicating honestly and openly, some figuring out of where your mutual values and boundaries are, and that's hard for anyone in any relationship. But the good part about this is that because the INFP is so naturally tuned into their own feelings and other people's feelings, if they decide to have this conversation, they have a lot of skills that other types don't necessarily have for navigating that language and navigating those kind of uncomfortable spaces. So use your gift as an INFP in situations like this to make sure you're having those conversations instead of just allowing them to grow and grow and grow inside of your head into problems that might never happen, but can nonetheless feel so overwhelming that you might consider ending a relationship before it even has the chance to begin, okay? Don't let that happen. It is so avoidable. Challenge number 3 that I see INFPs struggle with, even before the dating phase, sometimes this can come up. In the phase where, let's say, you're just single and going out and meeting people and taking interest in people, I see a lot of INFPs struggling with seeming a lot colder and more distant than they actually are. So if you could pry open an INFP's brain and look inside, it is generally filled with very warm thoughts about people. Like, INFPs tend to be quite positive about the people in their lives, particularly the people who they like or are interested in or want to form more of a relationship with. They are very good at seeing the best in people and thinking wonderful thoughts about people, but they aren't always as good at communicating those thoughts. So having introverted feeling gives you this specific feeling sometimes of thinking that everyone can hear your thoughts. Because your emotions and your thoughts are so loud inside your own head, there can be this natural assumption that that somehow escapes as you're living your day-to-day life and other people just know how you feel. And the problem is this is not always the case. So an INFP might feel really, really strongly towards someone. They might meet someone and really be interested in them, but not emote that enough to make the other person clear on the fact that that's how they feel. And this is largely an accident. I've heard a lot of INFPs talk about this, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a romantic relationship. I've heard INFPs say they're surprised that their friends or their family members or their coworkers don't know how positively they feel towards them and are surprised when they find out. And that's just because as an INFP, you are an introverted type, and your first instinct is not necessarily to emote everything that you're thinking or feeling. That takes conscious practice, but it can often lead to this big disconnect between the way that the INFP thinks about others and the way that they are showing up and letting them know how they feel about them. So another kind of relationship challenge that might stop a relationship from getting off the ground before it even has the chance to begin is the INFP not expressing their emotions despite the fact that they're feeling them. And again, this is a learned skill, and it's a learned skill for any type. This isn't just difficult for the INFP, it's just that the INFP might be the type who has the greatest discrepancy between the kind and warm and loving and caring and curious thoughts that they have and their natural propensity to express them. ISFP probably struggles with that in about equal measure. So again, this is just something to be aware of as an INFP. If you're feeling these wonderful and warm and curious thoughts towards someone, are you sure that they know you're thinking that, right? Have you made that clear to them? Because that's a really important building block for getting to know someone, is letting them know, hey, I'm interested in you. I want to get to know more about you. So the next challenge is one that, again, I do see more with younger INFPs. I think that the more the INFP grows up and has experiences with relationships and kind of notices what did and didn't go so well, they can veer out of this tendency and actually become very, very adept at doing the opposite of this. But early on in life, something that I see a lot of INFPs struggling with is not wanting to kind of give up information about themselves. They want someone to come along and absolutely pry things out of them. And this is absolutely a product of leading with introverted feeling. So when you have introverted feeling in the dominant position in your cognitive stacking, so that is INFPs and ISFPs, there is this deep, deep understanding of the self, this deep self-awareness that can develop, this very intense familiarity of the landscape of your own mind. And that is such a brilliant and beautiful trait, but there can also be a little bit of ego around it. And this is true for any type who has FI in their dominant or auxiliary position. So ENFPs and ESFPs are also very guilty of this. We just tend to talk a little bit more, so it spills out more naturally. But INFPs and ISFPs can fall into the trap of going, because I am so aware of my inner landscape, I need someone else to come along and be fascinated by it and to want to ask more and more questions and kind of see me as like this unending, fascinating book that they want to peruse through. And if the other person isn't necessarily showing this insatiable curiosity, the INFP might mistake that to mean that they're disinterested in them. But what that could actually mean is that the other person just doesn't understand that the INFP wants that. Maybe they think that they're being very respectful of the INFP's boundaries by not asking too many prying questions, or by kind of giving them the space to open up in the way that they feel comfortable when they feel comfortable. But there can be this kind of romanticized notion among young FI DOMs of wanting someone to come break down all of their walls and not realizing that it's actually very healthy for someone to not want to break down your walls, right? Because other people see walls as boundaries, and they're like, yeah, you can reveal yourself to me at a pace you're comfortable with, and I'm going to respect that you'll tell me what you want to tell me about yourself when you're ready to. And this is very different than someone who is just truly disinterested in you, right? This doesn't mean that if someone's paying you no attention and not answering your texts, they're just respecting your boundaries. But if you really pay attention, if you really focus in on the relationship that you're forming, the difference is usually very clear between someone who's just a bit confused about where your boundaries are and someone who just doesn't care and isn't interested in getting to know you, right? There is a natural kind of give and take to relationships. So if you're asking someone lots of questions about themselves and they're asking you an equal number of questions about yourself, that probably means that you're on a good track, right? But don't feel like someone needs to be prying into the depths of your soul and trying to break down all of your walls. That's asking someone to do the work that you need to be doing, which is figuring out when it's the right time to disclose what and offering information up about yourself to other people without them having to pry, even though it feels less romantic, maybe. At the end of the day, all it actually means is that you're with someone who has a pretty good understanding of boundaries, and that is going to become really attractive the longer the relationship goes on. Relationship challenge number 5, which everyone probably was expecting as relationship challenge number 1, because it can show up at any point in the dating process. So when you're single, when you're starting to see someone, when you're in a serious relationship, when you have been married for 50 years and have 4 children together. And this one is putting your partner on a pedestal. Now, this is one that all FI users are very guilty of. INFPs, ENFPs, ISFPs, ESFPs. Other types can obviously be very guilty of this as well, but having FI high up in your stacking makes you particularly prone to this. And I need to call us all out here for a minute and say that we think this is a nice thing to do, right? We think that thinking of our partner in these idealized and really beautiful and wonderful ways and kind of putting embellishments on top of the reality of who someone is inside of our own minds is a generous and loving thing to do because we're seeing the best in people. But that is absolutely not what we're doing when we're putting someone on a pedestal, okay? When you put someone on a pedestal, you refuse to see the real them. And when you refuse to see the real someone because you're not necessarily paying attention to the things that they're struggling with, to their genuine challenges and flaws, to their insecurities, and the ways in which they're a little bit afraid to show you the more human parts of themselves, you are cutting the opportunity for connection off at the knees, okay? Because real connection is built on two people who truly and deeply see each other, for better but also for worse. And again, the for worse can't just be the romanticized flaws that you have. It has to be the real stuff. The stuff that is actually hard for the other person to share with you. And for that to happen, they need a very safe and authentically open space for sharing within the relationship. When you put someone on a pedestal and decide that they only have good and wonderful and glowing qualities, you rob them of the opportunity to actually share themselves with you because you're going to ignore all of those more vulnerable and difficult parts of themselves that they try to bring to the table. And this is probably the number one mistake that I see FI users of all types making in any relationship, is thinking that they're doing their partner a favor by thinking of them in this way, when what they're really doing is creating a fantasy relationship instead of a real relationship, right? And it does not feel good for the other person to have fantasies projected onto them, okay? It feels like they are now expected to live up to this kind of glorified version of themselves that doesn't feel real, that might make them feel like, oh, I'm not good enough for you as I am. I have to be this kind of shining star that you see me as. And it also just feels lonely to be on a pedestal, right? Because it feels like there's no one there who has your actual back. There's only someone who wants to kind of clap at and admire you. And admiration is not real love, right? Admiration creates expectation to continue to behave in these very specific ways that are inauthentic. So if you want to do your partner at any stage of a relationship a very deep and loving favor, take them off the pedestal. Refuse to see them as perfect, as flawless, as someone whose flaws are romantic and beautiful and only wonderful. I see a lot of FI users romanticizing certain flaws, but then when their partner comes to them with a true challenge or struggle, they almost get a little bit mad because for a moment it knocks their partner off this pedestal they've put them on in their brain. And that really sucks for your partner if you cannot face their true flaws and challenges, right? That really takes away the opportunity to build true connection. And so I think that this is the biggest hurdle that all FI users have to learn to get over in relationships if they want true, deep connection with people rather than just kind of shallow fantasy relationships that happen mostly inside of their heads. Refuse to put anyone on a pedestal. Refuse to look at anyone and see the answer to your problems. Refuse to look at anyone and see a romantic love story. See only what actually is. Focus only on the actual connections you're building in real time and the feedback that you're getting from that other person. And you're going to start building real, true, non-anxiety inducing relationships because they're founded around the bare bones of what actually allows a relationship to grow and thrive, which is real-time interaction, not fantasy and idealization. That's a trap that it's very tempting to get stuck in, but that ultimately leads absolutely nowhere that you want to go. Relationship challenge number 6 that I often see INFPs struggling with, usually in the phase of a relationship where things are becoming a little bit more stabilized. So at the beginning of relationships, INFPs tend to be very all in. They're excited about relationships. They want to get to know someone. They are a little bit more lax with their boundaries than they might usually be. So they might be a little bit more social than normal, a little bit more out of their shell than they normally are in day-to-day life because this feeling of getting to know a new person and being excited about them gives them a lot more social energy. But as the relationship kind of stabilizes and settles down, they tend to revert a little bit more to their more naturally introverted ways. And depending on who they're dating, this could be either a natural mutual reclusion, let's say they're with another introvert, or it could cause a little bit of tension because let's say they're dating someone who is a lot more extroverted than they are, who has come to expect this level of kind of engagement and reciprocity from the INFP and gets confused when suddenly that energy starts to drop a little bit and they need some more time to withdraw and attend to their introverted functions. And this is a normal part of any relationship, right? No matter what your personality types are, there's going to be that honeymoon period where nothing can go wrong and you're staring lovingly in each other's eyes, and then it's going to change to a different phase where you're really working out, like, what does this look like in reality? What does our day-to-day life look like together now that the kind of stars and the magic is settling a little bit? And what's really important for the INFP at this point is to remember that they do need a lot of space, okay? Even though they might want to please their partner so badly by just going, yeah, I'll give you the same amount of time and investment and energy that I was giving you at the very beginning of the relationship, that's not necessarily sustainable for them long term as introverts. So it can be difficult for INFPs to set those boundaries because, again, they want so badly to make other people happy, to make their partners feel comfortable, but it's not going to work if you're making your partner feel comfortable at the expense of what you need, which is a lot of alone time, a lot of space, a lot of room to revert to and take care of your introverted feeling and introverted sensing functions. And it is so okay to ask for space in a relationship. It is so okay to need a lot of time for yourself. You just have to learn how to communicate that in a kind way. So I find that a lot of INFPs will kind of veer too far in this direction of compromising their own boundaries, compromising their own boundaries, compromising their own boundaries, and then kind of snapping and just taking space without necessarily communicating in a reassuring way that that's what they need. And then their partner can be a little bit confused about what's going on. And this is such an easy thing to overcome because all it requires is having a couple conversations with someone where you talk about what your needs are. And if there's pushback, learn to see that as a red flag, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you have to end the relationship, but you need to learn to be very firm about your boundaries and notice whether the other person is taking that well or not. And again, being firm doesn't mean being unkind. It can sound like, hey, I love spending time with you. Just so you know, here's a little bit about who I am and how I normally operate. And I really hope that we can continue this relationship. And in order for me to do that healthily, I have to take a certain amount of time and space, and here's what that looks like for me, right? It can be a very loving and optimistic conversation where you're talking about how to make this work long term instead of assuming that your partner is going to panic or be mad if you set those boundaries, right? If you're with someone with a certain level of emotional intelligence, it's probably going to go well. Healthy people appreciate other people's boundaries, so you don't need to be afraid of setting those down. It can be a really, really wonderful and growing thing to approach, even if it's a little bit intimidating at the beginning. Relationship challenge number 7, and this is one that I see showing up at absolutely every stage of the relationship for INFPs, or I should say that has the potential to show up at any stage of the relationship. And this is mistaking love the feeling for love the verb. So again, INFPs largely live inside of their minds. They have this very rich and vivid inner world that is full of feeling, and a lot of that feeling is very positive, very warm towards their partner, but they can sometimes forget that feeling good thoughts about someone does not translate into the other person feeling loved unless you make that transition out of your head and into reality through loving actions, right? And it sounds very silly when you hear it laid out because it sounds very obvious. But again, all FI users can actually be very, very guilty of this, thinking that because we think such great and warm and kind thoughts towards someone, the other person automatically knows that that's how we feel. But love the feeling and love the verb, so doing and acting in loving ways towards someone, are very different things, right? And it's a bit dangerous to confuse the two. Because if we think that thinking good thoughts about someone is enough to sustain a healthy relationship, we are going to absolutely neglect our partners and then feel confused about why things are going wrong, right? It's really important to be aware of what it is that our partner needs from us in order to feel loved by us. So let's say your partner is a words of affirmation person, then communicating those warm feelings towards them might be all that they need to know that you love them. But let's say they are a quality time person. If you're not giving them enough quality time, if you're not clearing your schedule and physically showing up for them in ways that make them really notice that you're there and present with them, even if you have all the warm thoughts on earth about them, they're not necessarily going to feel fulfilled in the relationship. And of course, this should be a two-way street, right? You should both be very aware of what each other needs in order to feel loved and how to give it to each other. But I really do see and have myself fallen victim many times in my life to this kind of trap of someone coming to an FI user and being like, I don't really feel loved by or connected to you in as deep of a way as I want to. And the FI user kind of getting defensive and being like, I think loving thoughts about you all the time. What are you talking about? Like morning to night, I just think loving thoughts about you. But we forget that thinking loving thoughts about someone feels really good inside of our own heads, but it does nothing for the other person until we translate those thoughts into actions, right? Otherwise, it's kind of like we're just watching a nice movie about love in our heads, but that doesn't do anything for the other person. That's for us, right? Those positive feelings we're feeling, they're kind of selfish. They're kind of just us watching a movie in our brains about how happy we are. But if we're not actually showing up for the other person, communicating our feelings, figuring out what they need in order to feel loved, and then doing that, we are not loving someone. We are romanticizing someone. Those are very different things, right? Having positive thoughts is nice, but it's not love. Love is the actual work you do of showing up, communicating, connecting with someone, and actually being there for them in real time and space. That's love. Love the verb. And if your relationship does not include a lot of that, it's not going to be a healthy or growing or mutually fulfilling relationship. It's just going to be you watching a movie in your head, okay? And that is a trap that all FI users are hyper at risk of falling into, and I just really encourage all of us to be super, super aware of it. Are we actually showing up in real time for the people that we have these kind of thoughts about, or are we just dissociating into a fantasy about them? One of those things is love, the other one, really not at all. Relationship challenge number, what are we on? 8? I think this is 8. That I see INFPs struggling with, often in long-term relationships, is thinking that conflict is an inherently bad thing. And again, this is kind of a double-edged sword because I think that early on, a lot of INFPs really struggle with this, but then they can become almost super adept at it if they learn the language for navigating conflict in a way that is healthy and growing. I think that INFPs can be some of the best mediators, the best communicators, if and when they choose to consciously develop this skill, okay? But the more an INFP, but generally speaking, before that awareness develops, the more an INFP grows connected to someone, the more they tend to feel like this person is a part of me. That is what introverted feeling kind of feels like when they're in love. But this can lead to this feeling of, therefore, if we have any conflict, anything where I start to see your limits are here and my limits are here, or we're not aligned in some way, it can be perceived as a threat to that love, when really it's not a threat to that love at all, right? Conflict can be a very healthy and very growing thing because for someone to love you completely and fully, they need to know where your boundaries are. Boundaries are the things that we put up to show people, like, here is where I end and you begin, right? It's like a property line. If you're going to a house and they have a fence around their property, you understand everything within these bounds is that property. And I can marvel at it and enjoy it and be appreciative that I understand where it begins and ends and what it is and is not. And the same is true of human beings. When we put boundaries up, when we show other people, here's where I end and you begin, and often we see those lines the most clearly during healthy conflict, it gives the other person the gift and the option of appreciating you for all that you are, of really understanding, here's where I end and you begin, and I can now stand beside this fence and marvel at everything that's inside of it. Right? I'm not missing anything because I'm standing too close. And I find that a lot of INFPs tend to get drawn into very people-centered fields where they end up learning a lot of really awesome conscious communication tools. Nonviolent communication is an example that I bring up in a lot of my videos, and I find that this model tends to work really well for INFPs who tend to have an above average awareness of what their feelings and needs are. So when they learn to express that in a way that naturally differentiates themselves from their partner, and allows them to understand where that dynamic space between them is, this can be incredibly growing and incredibly healthy for relationships. But step 1 is just learning to let go of that fear of any conflict, meaning that love is being threatened, right? Healthy relationships are built on productive conflict, where you understand, here's your limit, here's my limit, where can we compromise and where can we not compromise? That is the mark of a relationship that's going to be able to make it. If you are never having conversations that feel a little bit uncomfortable, that's actually a giant red flag, right? Healthy, productive conflict is a green flag in relationships, and you might not love it at the time, But if you want to build healthy, sustainable long-term relationships, this is something that all feelers have to get a little bit more comfortable than we might naturally be with. So step one is just don't perceive it as a lack of love. If there's a conflict or there's something that comes up between you and your partner, learn to see it as a growth opportunity. And once again, INFPs who learn to do this tend to very quickly become very, very good at it. So see this as an opportunity for you to step more fully into yourself and become the excellent and assertive communicator that you already naturally have the skills for being. You just have to learn to train and nurture them within yourself. Relationship challenge number 9 that I see INFPs making, again, kind of at every phase of the relationship, but that can particularly come into play later in life or as a relationship becomes more serious and long-lasting, which is that the INFP assumes that they can read their partner's mind. So because introverted feeling is so curious about other people, because we want so deeply, so badly to understand people on a very core level, FI can sometimes become a little bit overconfident and think that we know other people more than they know themselves, or that our partner doesn't necessarily need to communicate with us because we already know everything that they're thinking and feeling and going through. And this is definitely not always the case, right? So it's very important to not stop consciously checking in with your partner, right? Early on in the relationship, INFPs tend to be very good at this because they naturally are curious about people. So they ask a lot of questions, they ask a lot of clarifiers. They really want to make sure that they're getting to the heart of who this person is and what makes up their psyche. But then 30 years down the line, they might kind of unconsciously start thinking, okay, I've got it now. There's not that much new in there for me to learn or interpret. And so they might start operating in certain situations as if they have already consulted their partner about something when they haven't. And it's so important to not allow that to become the case in your relationship. Even if you know this person pretty well, even if 90% of the time you're able to predict what they want, there is always that 10% where you need to give them the benefit of the doubt. And if you don't, it could cause a lot of problems in the relationship. And what's more, people like being checked in with, right? Even if you've been with someone for a really long time, it helps with keeping the attraction alive in the relationship if you are perpetually curious about and getting to know your partner in new and different ways. So don't assume that you can mind read your partner, that you know what they want and what their interests and what their curiosities are at every point in the relationship. Because even if you're right, even if you truly do most of the time know what their decision is going to be, it just feels good to be checked in with at any stage. It feels good to feel like my partner is still curious about me. You probably want that from your partner, so don't forget to give it to someone else when you're in a long-term relationship, and continue to get to know your partner with the same curiosity you had right at the very beginning. Okay, relationship challenge number 10 is going to feel ironic at this point in the video after we have spent the past 9 points talking about what the INFP really struggles with and might accidentally get wrong in the relationship. But this one is over-assuming responsibility for everything that goes wrong. Now, because INFPs are very self-aware, they spend a lot of time observing their own psyche. That's kind of their superpower, right? Is really getting to understand their own minds. They can over-assume responsibility for everything that happens in their relationship. So anytime something goes wrong or anytime there is a problem, they can spend so much time analyzing their own role in it and trying to figure out where they went wrong or where they didn't necessarily say or do the right thing, that they can actually lose sight of the very real things that their partner might be doing wrong. And they can over-assume responsibility for the problems in their relationship when what they really need to be doing is interpersonally working those things out. It actually feels a lot more comfortable for a lot of INFPs to decide everything is a me problem so that I can just fix it internally without having to do that interpersonal repair work in the real world. And they can default to that method of problem solving of just adjusting and adjusting and adjusting the self to the scenario instead of realizing sometimes the scenario needs adjusting, right? Sometimes the other person is at least partially at fault here, and this problem needs to be worked out between us, not just internally inside of my own mind. So as much as it's good to be aware of all of these challenges and all of these potential pitfalls or mistakes that you might make within a relationship, it's also super important to be aware of what is not yours to own, okay? And what you really do need to work out between you and the other person, and what requires a little bit of their participation as well, if not a lot of their participation. Be aware of this when you're single, be aware of this in the dating phase, and be especially aware of this in long-term relationships where really big problems can crop up and where they will only get worse and worse and worse if they require the other person's participation to solve, but you're not offering the other person the opportunity to participate in that problem-solving process, right? It is a loving thing to work out relationship problems between the two of you rather than just thinking you can deal with everything on your own. All right, I think that is all that I have to say today about INFPs and relationship struggles, but as always, let me know in the comments which of these really resonated for you. Which ones would you add to this list if you had anything that you think is a really major challenge or struggle you go through that you didn't hear me talk about here? And let's just do as much supporting of each other as we can, because relationships are really hard, and the more we can share about what works and what doesn't work for us, the better that it gets for all of us. So thank you so much for watching this. A reminder that I do run a 6-week INFP Soul Bootcamp course, which you can find on my website at www.heidipriebe.com. I will link it in the description below. And if you are an INFP and you want to see more videos about INFPs, let me know what you want to see made, and I am more than happy to do what I can to make that happen. All right, I love you guys. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you back here again soon.